So this is APR on MH Connect for the nervous system, module 7. And we're going to go through the pertinent parts. So let's start with the spinal cord. And I'm on the dissection tool. So you have an overview, which really doesn't help us. We could do the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar region of the overview. But let's look at a typical spinal nerve first. I think that's a cool one. So this is a cross section looking down at a typical spinal nerve. So you can see if I highlight something, it's the spinal cord. So that's orange. Could change the colors too. So that orange highlighted is the spinal cord. It's the gray matter too. Then this is just the white matter. And then there's gray matter. And that's the question. Just like that. And then we have the nerves. Let's see what that looks like. This will be on the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal rootlets. Those little things there. Ventral ramus. I won't ask that. Ventral root, though, is important. See how that's highlighted towards this vertebral body. The ventral root. So the dorsal root is in the back. Ventral root. And then the dorsal root ganglion. Beautiful. That's perfect. Anything else? That's it. Membranes are like the pia mater and dura mater. So that would be dura mater there in green. And then the epidural space. That's the only thing that's showing there. And let's look at something else. Spinal cord. Let's go to the big stuff, the brain. Select view or look at the lateral view. And see, you won't see this, but we have to go deep. So brain tissue and the group. I don't know why it's not going anywhere. Sorry, I knew this was going to happen. Group, membranes, nerves, brain. Brain. The view is lateral. Let's look at coronal. Okay, select type, brain, we got coronal, inferior. And this is the view where you're going to get most of your cranial nerves. This is the inferior view. So let's see, this is nerves. Okay. So this is a really important one because it's going to give you the cranial nerves that you need to know. So this is the frontal lobe up top. This is the cerebellum, and the cranial nerves are mostly off of the brain stem and up here on the frontal lobe. So let's look at cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. That's cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 is optic. And don't forget you have the optic chiasm. It's a different structure. Optic chiasm, optic nerve. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, is here. Cranial nerve 4, trochlear nerve. Is it lighting up? Yeah, I see it's very light. See how small it is? Right in here. See that tiny little nerve? Of course I'm not. Well, I can put that one. It's pretty easy. Actually, cranial nerve 6. Right there. Cranial nerve 7. This is where it gets hard. So pay attention here. And I'm going to do a review next week too. So you'll see the difference in the ones I like. I'm just showing you them all now because this is the lab. So that's cranial nerve 7. Cranial nerve 8 is probably a little bit more difficult. Let's see, where is that? 9, 7, where's 8? There it is. Cranial nerve 8. So again, cranial nerve 8 is what you're seeing now. That's cranial nerve 7. Then you have cranial nerve 9 right here. And then cranial nerve 10, which I always put on the practical. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve. You see those little spikes on it? Because it used to be a spinal nerve. And cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal. See what that is. So let's do it one more time. Sorry, it's a little out of order, but I want to do it in order right now. So olfactory bulb is part of cranial nerve 1, but it's up here. So this is the olfactory bulb. Olfactory nerve is cranial nerve 1. CN1, and it's in Roman numerals, as you can see. Is it there? It's olfactory nerve, though. And tract is behind them. It's really the nerve, really. So that's the same thing. So olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1 could be the bulb or the tract. You could say either. You could, for both of these, you could say cranial nerve 1 or olfactory nerve. They're both acceptable. You don't have to say cranial nerve 1. You could say olfactory and you'd be correct. Now here's the optic nerve. This is important. See, optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. Then you have the optic chiasm, which is the crossover of cranial nerve 2. Then you have the optic tract, which is behind the optic chiasm. So again, cranial nerve 2, optic chiasm, and then optic tract. Those are points you should know. Cranial nerve 3 is oculomotor, fairly big at the top of the pons. Cranial nerve 4 is going to be abducens. I'm sorry, trochlear. That's the tiny one off of the pons. I probably won't put that one. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve, and that's pretty big. So there's a good chance I'll put that on the test. And it kind of sits by itself. It has 3 branches, but you can't see that in this picture. So cranial nerve 5 here is the trigeminal nerve. And cranial nerve 6 is abducens. And that's right there between the pons and the medulla oblongata. And we'll look at those parts too. So cranial nerve 7 is the facial. Here's where it gets hard. So facial 7, and then 8 is vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 9 is glossopharyngeal, a little thinner. And cranial nerve 10 is vagus. They're in alphabetical order over here on the left, I just realized. And cranial nerve 11 gets a little weird because it gets kind of spread out. Cranial nerve 11 is accessory nerve. And then cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal. So this is all inferior brain. That's really, I mean, you can see other structures too. Let's see. So those are the cranial nerves. So again, they'll be on the recording and you'll be able to see everything. So let's see here. So here's the different parts of the brain. The cranial nerves are the hardest thing, I think, on the nervous system on this exam. So spend a little time on that and watch the recording next week when I do the review. After reproductive, of course. So brain is the whole thing, of course. And then the brain stem is the medulla oblongata. In this view, you can only see the medulla oblongata, which is orange, and the pons. And you can see where those cranial nerves come off of. Then this is going to be the cerebellum, all of that orange. And this is on the exam for sure. And then you could also see the cerebrum is all the gyri and everywhere else, like the frontal lobe versus the occipital lobe, which you can't really see, except look at the bottom, right? There it is. So this is cerebellum, that's occipital lobe of the cerebrum. And the temporal lobe. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and it has 4 lobes that you can see. there's a fifth lobe called insula, which is inside, and we talked about that in lecture. So again, we'll go back and watch the recordings from last semester that I left for you, which will walk you through it a little bit. But this is what the questions on the test are right here. So check it out. Diencephalon, we might be able to catch a little bit of that. The mammillary bodies right here, which is like below the hypothalamus, right there, those two little orange things. Excellent. So that's the brain. Let's see if we can see other views. This is the coronal view. Looking at the front, you can see the brain, and we can look at the brain stem, which really isn't on there. The ventricles. Fourth ventricle. I wouldn't put these pictures on. So this I'm going to kind of run through quickly. This view I will not put on. So let's look at other coronal things we might be able to see. Cerebrum. This would be the best. Corpus callosum is always a question. This is a frontal view. That's the corpus callosum. Gray matter, which is all the cortex in orange in this case. Longitudinal fissure, right, goes right between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Then you have the lobes, like the parietal lobe. It's in the back. Again, this is in alphabetical order. That's frontal lobe. Let's see if you can see the lateral ventricles. Those are the lateral ventricles right here in the middle, right below the corpus callosum. My parietal lobe we saw. Temporal lobe, right there, because it's cut in the front view. Look up here, you see the view. And the white matter is everything that's not cortex. So everything that's not orange is the white matter. So that's a good way to look at it. And everything else, diencephalon in the coronal view. Hypothalamus, I probably won't ask that. Septum pellucidum I may though. Septum pellucidum is here between the two ventricles. Thalamus and the third ventricle is right below that. Excellent. So we need a lateral view. I couldn't get that before for some reason. Lateral. And we want to see the brain. I don't know why it's not changing. Layer, here you go. So this is a pretty common picture for this. So look at the different things, the brain, of course. You can see the brain stem, which is the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So pons, midbrain, medulla oblongata. And the diencephalon would be the hypothalamus. And you can also see the cerebral aqueduct here, which is right here between the midbrain, posterior and anterior midbrain. So let's look at the diencephalon, which here you can see the pineal gland, the pituitary gland. Septum pellucidum is up there below the corpus callosum, between the ventricles. The thalamus. Okay. The hypothalamus is here. I don't know why it's not on this list, as we saw before, but this is the hypothalamus. We go back to where it said brainstem. That's really where the hypothalamus was. But the diencephalon is the hypothalamus, thalamus, and epithalamus. So this is definitely on the exam, the hypothalamus. But again, we'll go through it on the review so you can see everything. So diencephalon is more than just what's here. That's the thalamus. Okay, membranes. Let's see if we can see them here. Don't really use those. Meninges, we do. Dura mater, right, which covers the outside. If you remember that. Other things. That's most of it, really. That's most of it. Let me just stop the recording for a second. I'll share that screen. Everybody see this? Just to show you the parts.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Very cool. So this is kind of like the review, what I'll show you. And like this is the cerebellum highlighted. Cerebellum. Now this is the model showing you the cerebellum. This is the cerebral aqueduct, like I showed you. Same thing, cerebral aqueduct. This is just asking for the cerebrum, the largest part with the gyri and sulcus. This is all reproductive, and here is the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum in the model. Here's the cerebellum. This is the olfactory bulb. Still olfactory bulb or nerve. You could say olfactory nerve at this point too. That's olfactory tract. So bulb, tract. But they're both nerve. Cranial nerve 1. That's the optic chiasm. Optic nerve. That's cranial nerve 3. That's oculomotor. Cranial nerve 4. So you got to do a close up for that one. Trochlear. That's the cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 5, trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 6, abducens. Cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear. Cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 12. This is cranial nerve 11. Cranial nerve 12. So let me do this again. 6, 7, 8, and 10. Sorry. So abducens, cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 7, facial, cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear, cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 11, accessory nerve, cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal. So please go back to the APR and do these. Practice, practice those. A lot of reproductive in between. This is showing you the 4th ventricle right here. 4th ventricle between the pons and the cerebellum. This is frontal lobe. That's all it's showing. This is the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. Frontal lobe of the cerebrum. This is showing you the pia mater, the covering of the brain, the innermost, right? Remember, it's the dura, arachnoid, and pia is the innermost. And these are ventricles here. This is corpus callosum. That's hypothalamus right there. This is the pituitary right there, and the sella turcica, the sphenoid. This is the hypothalamus. This is just showing you the stalk off the hypothalamus called the infundibulum, or the pituitary stalk. This is infundibulum. This is the lateral sulcus between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. This is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata, again, different view, inferior view. This is a neuron now, showing you the nerve tissue. So this is the cell body with the nucleus. These are dendrites up here. This extension off the neuron is your axon. So the answer to this one is axon. These are dendrites. And that's cell body, also known as soma. That's occipital lobe of the cerebellum. Be careful between the occipital lobe and the cerebellum here. This is all follicles that you'll have to know for reproductive. There's ovaries. Right here is the parietal lobe of the cerebrum, and this is the post-central gyrus right here. This is the pre-central gyrus. Parietal lobe on the model. This is frontal. Orange is frontal. Yellow is temporal. The gray on the bottom is the cerebellum. This is pituitary gland. This is pineal. Pituitary gland, pineal gland. Pituitary gland, pineal gland. That is the pons, part of the brainstem. Pons from the inferior view. This is the longitudinal fissure. The red would be the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. This blue right here would be the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. This is the central canal of the spinal cord. So this is the cross-section of the spinal cord, like I showed you on the model before. So I choose from these pictures for the, of course, not all of them will be on, but this is the ones I like. This is your dorsal or posterior fasciculus, or funiculus, I'm sorry, funiculus. The back of the spinal cord. And it's white matter, like this is gray matter. So this is your dorsal funiculus or posterior funiculus. It's fine, either way. That's the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. That's the dorsal root ganglion. So there's always going to be pictures like this. This is anterior ventral. This is posterior dorsal. And this blue is the dorsal root ganglion. Now this is the APR. So this is the dorsal root ganglion again. This is the bones, right? The spinous process, the transverse processes. Again, dorsal root ganglion. So you know you're going to see dorsal root ganglion on this in one way or another. This is dorsal root. Dorsal root. That is the gray matter of the spinal cord, highlighted in orange. This is the lateral funiculus, or white column, you could say. We could say white column, or as long as you say lateral, it's on the sides. That's the lateral gray horn. This you could just say spinal nerve, because look, both roots, dorsal and ventral, come together to form the spinal nerve. So the 26 here is the spinal nerve. Same thing here, spinal nerve. This is the ventral root of the gray matter of the spinal cord. Same thing here, ventral root, highlighted in yellow. Same thing here, ventral root. This week, all you'd have to say here is the white matter of the spinal cord. Temporal lobe of the cerebrum. Temporal lobe of the cerebrum from the inferior view. Temporal lobe again. It's like the thumb of the boxer glove. Temporal lobe of the cerebrum. Inferior view of the temporal lobe. This whole thing, all of this orange is the diencephalon, because it has the thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus on it. So this is an important one. This is all female reproductive, male reproductive. And that's pretty much it on what I could choose out of the 50 questions on the exam, and that's due on the 19th.